I will never forget the first time I listened to a HiFiMan Susvara headphone. I didn't take note of what track it was that I was listening to, but I do know it contained a prominent acoustic guitar. I remember that because the Susvara did something that I don't think any other headphone had ever done or has done ever since. It had a sense of feel to the pluck of the guitar string that was absolutely electrifying. I heard and felt the sound like it was a close-up, super slow motion video of that moment in time. It was like I could hear the fingertip make contact with the string, like I could hear the string stretch, the friction of the finger as it then slid off the string, and then the movement of air as the string rebounded and began its resonant vibrations. It was one of those revelatory and addictive moments in audio. Fast forward about 4 years, and the FiiO FT7 headphones arrived on my doorstep. FiiO sent them to me for review, but they have no influence over the content of this video. And my first thought about the FiiO FT7s was that they looked a lot like a Susvara clone. Not just on the outside, but on the inside and in their tuning measurements too. On the outside, they have the same round cup design and also this horizontal window shade style grille. The FT7s use zebra wood here instead of metal on the Susvaras, but the similarities are definitely there. Inside the headphones are some large 106mm planar magnetic diaphragm, so there are some similarities there too. But where it started to get really interesting for me was when I read the marketing and discovered that the traces or the wiring on the diaphragms for the FT7s are made with both silver and gold. The Susvaras used a gold trace on their diaphragms, and I always wondered how much influence the use of gold had on the sound of those headphones. Of course, there are so many factors to the sound of a headphone, so it's going to be more than just the use of gold as the trace on the diaphragm, but I did wonder just how much influence the gold might have on various characteristics of their sound. And so here was a brand new, round design, planar magnetic headphone using silver and gold traces on the diaphragms. Could it be a partially cloned Susvara, or was it something different? At $699, the FT7s carry a very different price tag than the megabuck Susvaras, and I think they also look and feel more premium in some ways. The FT7s are built from wood, metal, and even carbon fiber. They also come with 2 different pad choices. You've got the leather pads that I've got here and that come fitted in the box, as well as some fabric pads too. And I'll talk about the sonic differences of the pads in just a moment. Another difference between the Susvara and the FT7 is that the FT7s are far easier to drive. While the Susvara's difficulty to drive is actually overrated in many cases, they are still way more difficult to drive than the FT7s. The FT7s have an impedance of 25 ohms and a sensitivity of 94 decibels per milliwatt. And that means an amp with 100 milliwatts or more at 32 ohms will absolutely have the FT7s cooking. So don't worry about what you need to drive these, they're very easy to drive. And while we're talking about amplifiers, it's also worth talking about the cable that you'll get to connect your FT7s to your amplifier. The cable provided with the FT7s seems to be of pretty good quality. It's tastefully finished in this black and gold fabric, and it's not too stiff in use. It doesn't want to hold its shape too badly. However, as you can see here in my hand and how I've got it bundled up, it is way too long for my tastes. It's one of those cables that often ends up piled up on the floor next to you unless you're sitting way back from your headphone amplifier. It might be great for some people's armchair listening setups where they're a long way from their devices, but it's not going to be so good for semi-portable use or for desktop use for most people. And on that note, if you need to swap your cables for your FT7s or any other headphones you have, channel sponsor for this video, Deconi Audio, have now released some new options in their awesome ensemble cable system. They also have lower prices now than they used to, and you can get an additional 10% off, which I'll tell you about in just a moment. If you're not familiar with the ensemble system from Deconi Audio, the way it works is they've got a design where you buy one end of the cable that plugs into your headphone amplifier. At the other end, you can choose the connections you need for your headphones, and you just buy a little piece like this that goes to your headphones. And now they've even got the Limo style connectors for options like the Focal Utopia and similar headphones. The idea is that you can minimize clutter by leaving this end attached permanently to your headphones and then just have one single long cable connected to your headphone amp at all times. You then just swap this end of the headphone cable between the different headphones of choice. In the past, the ensemble range included a basic copper cable and a silver-plated copper cable, but they've now added this high-quality PCU HD copper cable. This is a great option for people like me that want maximum sound quality and performance without necessarily getting that sense of increased clarity or brightness that silver-plated copper can sometimes bring. I've been using this PCU HD copper cable with my Utopias lately, and it's a really good match with those. So if you want to simplify your cable life, just visit DaconiAudio.com and make sure you use the code PassionForSound10 at the checkout to get a 10% discount off any purchase you make, whether it's on the cables, replacement ear pads, replacement ear tips for earphones, or even carry cases for headphones. And what's more, you can use it over and over again whenever you need something from Daconia Audio. So thank you to them for sponsoring this video and giving you a 10% discount code. And now let's get back to the FT7s. As I said earlier, I'd taken some measurements, so I already knew that they measured fairly similarly to the Susvaras, and so I was getting a little bit excited about what I was going to hear. I put the headphones on my head, and then spent the next 7 minutes pulling the cable through my hands until I got to the plug that goes into the headphone amp, and then I plugged that into the Burson Soloist Voyager amp. What I heard then was a sound that I would describe as being just a little bit brighter than what I consider to be natural. That's not a bad thing at all, and it's worth knowing if you're not familiar with me and my channel, that I tend to prefer a sound that is slightly warmer than what many people would describe as neutral. If we break that sound down by the frequency bands and start thinking about the bass, the FT7s deliver a very linear bass response. In other words, it's pretty flat from all the way at the beginning of the bass up high down to the bottom levels of bass down in the sub bass, but they do deliver a nice sense of punch when the music calls for it. And that's basically what the FT7s are about. If it's in the recording, they're going to let you hear it. At the other end of town, the treble from the FT7s is well extended and quite refined. And to my ears, I didn't hear anything that sounded like specific enhancement of the treble, but everything was definitely there. There was nothing lacking at all. Where the FT7s were really shining, to my ears at least though, was in their mid-range. The FT7s don't enhance or push the mid-range forward as such, but because the bass isn't enhanced and the treble isn't enhanced, they allow the mid-range to really shine. That makes vocals and instrumentals extremely enjoyable from the FT7s. They also produce a soundstage with very good instrument separation, but the overall size of the soundstage is what I would call modest. In other words, these aren't a headphone that produces an expansive soundstage, but they do create an excellent sense of space around each sound within the soundstage. Basically, they were performing about as I expected given their price tag. And if you're familiar with the HiFiMan Susvaras, you'll know that that means that these are not a clone of the HiFiMan Susvaras at 1/10 of the price of the Susvaras. They are tuned quite similarly, but they're on a very different level of technical performance. And that's okay, because these are $700. And I think they sound great for a $700 headphone. The question now was just how great do they sound for a $700 headphone? Before I could answer that question though, I needed to decide which pad I thought was best on the FT7s, the leather that comes fitted to it or the fabric that's in the box. Both pads use perforated leather or maybe synthetic leather on the inside surface of the pad where it's going to be inside with your ear. And so the overall sound is quite similar from both, but it's definitely not identical. With the leather pads, the sound is noticeably brighter and crisper than it is with the fabric pads. As to which pad's going to sound best, that's going to largely come down to your preferences, your music tastes, and which DAC and headphone amp you're pairing the FT7s up with. But there are a couple of other details to consider beyond just that slight difference in crispness and brightness. And the key thing here is that I felt like the leather pads were delivering just a little bit more sense of space in the soundstage and specifically space around each sound. However, for me, that was coming at the trade-off of being a little bit more fatiguing sometimes. The cloth pads felt a bit nicer on my head, just from a comfort point of view, and I prefer the slightly smoother sound that they delivered, but I then missed the sense of space that the leather pads created. The cloth pads don't get congested, the leather pads are just a little bit better. And so all in all, I think I would choose the leather pads on a system that's a little bit smoother and warmer. Perhaps if you've got, say, a tube amp in there, or maybe something rich and warm like a Pietus Maximus headphone amp. I also think the leather pads would probably be good for classical music listening. On the other hand, if you've got a very neutral, clean sounding source chain, or energetic music that's maybe not always the best recording quality, such as pop, a lot of rock, even some electronic music where they're using samples, I'd probably lean towards the fabric pads for that. And the best part about all of this is that you get both pads in the box. So you can choose which pads you like by trying both of them for free. In other words, free once you buy the headphones. That also brings me to a point that I should mention, which is that the pad changing system is wonderful. It's a very clean and simple clip system, but it doesn't look like it's one that's going to break easily. And so all you need to do is pull off the pad like you just saw me do, line up the clips, and you can use the lettering inside the pad if you can see that, and then you just line it up and click it in. Make sure you do click it in properly all the way around, or you'll get some pretty wonky frequency response if you leave a gap. And so after much back and forth to choose if I like the leather pads or the fabric pads, for all of my testing, I was using the fabric pads. That was what I preferred with my 2 source chains that I used for this test, being the Chord Dave DAC and the Burst & Soloist Voyager headphone amp, or the Topping D900 and the Topping A900 DAC and headphone amp. And by the way, make sure you subscribe if you want to know my thoughts on the Topping A900, because that review's coming up fairly soon. Not straight away, but not too far away. My first point of comparisons for the FT7s was another headphone that's brand new and recently reviewed here on the channel, and that's the Meze Audio 105 Silvers. The Silvers cost a bit less than the FT7s do, but they're an excellent headphone and seem like a good place to start. The first thing I noticed listening to Reapers by Muse with the FT7s was just how solid and energetic the kick bass sounded from the FT7s. These might be tuned fairly neutrally, but they don't lack bass. They're really good in that sense. The guitars also had a lovely sense of attack and articulation, and the vocals were present, they had a good sense of weight, and were very well focused in the soundstage. It seemed like the Silvers were already in trouble. Swapping over then to the Silvers revealed that they have a significantly brighter tuning than the FT7s. And when I say a brighter tuning, what I probably should be saying is they've got more enhancement in the treble. Things like cymbal crashes were much more prominent from the 105 Silvers than they were on the FT7s. And that meant that the cymbals tended to overshadow the rest of the music a little bit. I know that some people are actually going to prefer the sense of enhanced treble from the Silvers because it brings an additional sense of clarity or detail and emphasis, and some people love that. But I was more excited to get back to the FT7s because of the way they drew me into the mid-range, the vocals, and what I think of as the heart of the music. I definitely still think that the 105 Silvers are an excellent headphone for their price, and I think technically they absolutely held their own against the FT7s, but the FT7s have it for me because of their tuning. They're a tuning that I find more enjoyable because of that mid-range balance. Not mid-range emphasis so much as it's just really well balanced in the mix. And so while I still had Reapers by Muse playing, I stayed with the Meze Audio theme and reached for the more expensive 109 Pros. As I just said, the 109 Pro is a bit more expensive than the FT7, and it's also tuned a bit differently from the 105 Silvers. The 109s significantly boost the bass compared to the FT7s, and that can make them sound a bit rambunctious and raucous on a track like Reapers. The FT7s, on the other hand, are a bit more balanced overall because of that much more linear tuning. And the result of that was that I found I could hear more into the music with the FT7s. All of the different sounds were laid out more evenly for me, and I could choose what I wanted to hear. And that actually made the FT7s sound a bit more technically capable than the 109 Pros. It's not necessarily that they are more technically capable, so much as the tuning makes everything more available, whereas from the 109 Pros, the enhanced bass and the enhanced treble tends to draw you specifically to each end and maybe covers up or masks some of the details sitting in the middle. On the other hand, the 109 Pros definitely hit harder. That enhanced bass and that enhanced treble brings a sense of energy and rhythm and drive to the music that you don't get from the FT7s. And so to help provide a bit of extra context and explanation here, I tried a much more mellow track in the form of Don't Come Home Too Soon. On this track, the 109 Pros delivered a sense of weight and body to the sound that I preferred over the FT7s. By comparison, the FT7s now sounded a little bit dry and a little bit nasal on this track. And that goes back to what I said at the beginning of this video, that the FT7s for me lean just a little bit drier or a little bit more kind of lean than what I think of as a natural sound. The 109s go in the other direction, so neither of these is perfect if you're looking for pure naturality, and so it's going to depend a little bit on just what you're looking for. I think this is also a great example of why we should never make up our minds on any piece of equipment with just one type of music. What sounds fantastic with one track might not sound so great with another. I could still hear more details and more clarity and information through the mid-range with the FT7s, but it wasn't as enjoyable of a tuning to my ears now. And so for me, I would generally prefer the FT7s on music that suits that sort of tuning, such as classical music, or on a system and a source chain that is noticeably lusher and richer, such as tubes or a Pietus Maximus or maybe a DSHA3FN. There's lots of different options out there to get that sense of lushness and richness that I would prefer them with, but then you might also like it more neutral. And I can't stress enough here, I was still very much enjoying the FT7s. I love their technical performance at their price point. I just personally would tune their sound a little bit with some upstream tweaks. You might prefer to do that with EQ, and that's completely fine as well. There's no reason to suggest that these won't handle EQ very well. I'm not going to talk about that though because I'm not an EQ user. And so at this point, I was impressed with the FT7s. I didn't love them in all situations, but in the right situations, I absolutely did love them. And that got me wondering just how good they might be against some stronger competition. And maybe I went a little bit too far at first. Looking at the measurements of the HiFiMan Arya Unveiled and the FiiO FT7 shows a pretty similar overall tuning shape. The biggest real difference here is that the Arya Unveiled has a significant peak in the treble that's about 6 dB higher than what the FT7 delivers. But beyond that, they're very similar. What was interesting though is that whilst the Arya Unveiled with that treble peak do sound brighter than the FT7s, they never sounded fatiguing. The FT7 sounded just a little bit thick by comparison, and they're definitely not a thick headphone, whereas the Aryas sounded cleaner and slightly brighter, but what came across most was that they seemed to be more refined in their delivery of those frequencies. Much like the FT7s, the Aryas also deliver excellent mid-range focus in their sound, although the emphasis has probably shifted just a little bit towards the upper mid-range band instead of the full mid-range band that you get with the FT7s, and that's going to come down to the fact that there is that boost in the treble on the Arya Unveiled. However, everything didn't go in favour of the Arya Unveiled here, despite it costing about twice as much or maybe even a bit more. One area that I often find HiFiMan headphones tend to struggle in is soundstage depth. They almost always produce excellent width in the soundstage, but it's often quite lateral, stretching from one ear to the other, straight through the middle of your head, or maybe up inside the forehead a little bit. With the FT7s, the sound stretches out a little bit more in front of you, and that provides some depth and some layering in the soundstage. The soundstage from the FT7s isn't quite as wide as it is from the Arya Unveiled, but to me it sounds more spacious because it's got that depth and that layering. That also means it sounds more natural, in my opinion at least. And then, of course, there's build quality and comfort. I personally prefer the look and feel of the FT7s by a significant margin. And when I say feel, I mean both in the hand and on the head. And so I think at the end of all of this, I'd say that the Arya Unveiled did best the FT7s, but not by a huge margin, and the FT7s are about half the price. And so from here, I wanted to scale back the competition just a little bit to see if I could find that balance point. Where exactly are the FT7s performing given their price tag? I'm currently also in the process of reviewing the SJY Audio Horizon Open headphones. That video is coming very soon, so again, be sure to subscribe if you want to know my thoughts on the SJY Audio Horizon Opens. For now though, let's talk a little bit about them in relation to the FT7s. This entire comparison of the SJY Audio Horizons and the FT7s was completed using the Topping D900 and the Topping A900 stack. And listening to Like I Can by Sam Smith, again the vocals from the FT7s were wonderful from that setup. And also again, the FT7s were impressive with their sense of articulation and clarity in the music. Despite the D900 and A900 stack producing a fairly neutral and clean sound, the FT7s weren't causing me any sense of fatigue or difficulty in listening. They were just thoroughly enjoyable. Swapping then to the $1,000 SJY Audio Horizon headphones revealed a completely different tuning. The Horizons are tuned much warmer and richer than the sound of the FT7s. And that's mostly coming down to the fact that they have much less treble than the FT7s and a little bit of a dip in the upper mid-range. That helps the Horizons to sound thicker and fuller overall, but it does come at a little bit of a cost. Or maybe not a cost, but a trade-off. Having less treble and upper mid-range energy means that the Horizons don't hit you with that same sense of clarity and detail that the FT7s do. The Horizons aren't immediately exciting in the way the FT7s might be, but the Horizons might be the more enjoyable headphone in the long run because they don't get fatiguing. This will all come down to a question of your preferences and your hearing sensitivities. If you enjoy a smoother sound like say the HD6 series from Sennheiser, the Horizons will probably be the better choice for you. But if you like a bit of extra sense of clarity, detail, texture, articulation in the sound, The FT7 sounded like they were a technical match for the more expensive Horizon headphones and might have even been extracting more detail than the Horizons. It's just going to depend on whether that extra sense of detail is going to be more enjoyable for you in the long run, or if it's just going to create fatigue and make you not want to listen to as much music. And by the way, don't judge the Horizons just on this comparison. There's a lot more nuance to their sound and the information I'm going to share with you. So make sure you just hit the subscribe button if you haven't already, and check out my review of the Horizons that's coming in just a matter of days now. But if we do take a step back for a moment and think about the FT7s in the context of all that we've spoken about here, what this is telling us is that the FiiO FT7 headphones, which cost $699 are actually competing at a technical level with headphones costing $800 to $1,000. They're also doing it while having outstanding build quality and comfort. To me, that makes the FiiO FT7s an absolute hit. Sure, they're not really an affordable version of the Susvara, but they are a wonderful headphone at their price. They're also a headphone that I will gladly and regularly recommend to anybody who's seeking a fairly neutrally tuned headphone that's also a very enjoyable headphone from a musical perspective. And if that sounds like a headphone that you'd like, I've put links in the description down below where you can pick up the FT7 for yourself. And don't forget to visit DaconiAudio.com for any pad changes, ear tip changes, cable changes, or headphone accessories that you might need. Just go to DaconiAudio.com and use the code PassionForSound10 for 10% off. And remember, you can use it over and over again. And now, having spoken a lot here about all of the different gear we use to listen to music, let me share with you now, with a pinned video here at the end, a video that's all about why you should listen to more music, and why having an audio setup that's going to want to make you listen to more music is actually going to be really good for your overall health and well-being. So watch that video next, but for now, a huge thanks to YouTube channel members, also to channel Patreon members, and of course to those of you who leave super thanks on videos like this one. And until next time, happy listening, be kind to each other, and I'll see you here again soon on Passion for Sound. Way better than options like the HiFiMan ones. It's a very clean and simple, of course they didn't have it right.